And this is a 4-series class. So each class is an hour and a half. For me, it's a bit of a scramble because it used to be originally 5 classes at 2 hours each. So it was 10 hours of class. So I had to cut everything down to 6 hours. So I've been, I'm still in the process of compressing things. But this class is actually it's actually a very nice class. I mean, it's a class that is good for, it's designed for beginners. So this class is designed for somebody who knows absolutely nothing about Buddhism, but is curious and would like to learn something about Buddhism. And it's also, surprisingly, I've had a lot of actually even, quite advanced students who actually have found the class very helpful as well, because it gives a broad overview of all of Buddhism. So it's all of Buddhism in 6 hours. So it gives you a chance to see the global picture. And for a lot of ordinary students, they often come to a center and they will, for example, immediately take a specific class in this area or a class in that area. And as a result, their knowledge of Buddhism is sort of patched together. They know about this, they know about this, but they never have a chance to see the broad picture and how everything fits together. So that's the purpose of this class. And it's actually quite fun to actually try to see the logic of all of Buddhism in a short, compressed thing where you can actually put it all together. And so in this class, we encourage a lot of questions. So the whole point of it is to actually, I think, mainly to answer questions. So whenever there's anything that you don't find that you find confusing or whatever, please ask, because that's the purpose of this class. And the other thing too is I try to introduce a lot of the terminology of Buddhism, because that's often very confusing. People, they hit terms like, I don't know, renunciation, nirvana, all of these various terminology things. And oftentimes they pick up some of these terms from common life, but the usage in Buddhism is often much more precise and different than the common knowledge of it. So clarifying this terminology is often very helpful, because then when people take other classes, they have a sense of what the terms mean. And also seeing the big picture, if you study one small piece of Buddhism, when you go into that class, you'll be able to see how that little piece fits in with the bigger picture and what the purpose of it is. So, in general, what I'm going to talk about in this life is very big questions. I mean, I'm going to start off with who Buddha was, sort of the bio of his life. We'll talk about how did Buddhism evolve after Buddha died? What happened to Buddhism when Buddha died? How did it evolve and move around the world and so forth? And we'll also talk about there's many, many different forms of Buddhism. As Buddhism spread to many different countries, it often has a different coloring. And so what I want to help identify is sort of the core of Buddhism that's common to all of these colorations from the various cultures that Buddhism moved to. So you can sort of pick out, what is the core and what is the coloration. And, more generally, I want to talk about just a simple question. Who is a Buddhism? Who is a Buddhist? What is Buddhism? And what I want to really emphasize is how Buddhism is really a very radical and different way of thinking about the world. And I sort of want to convey why it's so different and what it is that makes it so different. And I think we'll do that as you go through the class. Okay.
And Bob, can I just ask
Sure.
that also, it's like, for me, it's helpful if people talk a bit about how Buddhism has impacted on them, what it has meant to you, why you've chosen Buddhism, what you feel you've benefited, what the challenges are, particularly also how meditation has impacted on you. Those
Absolutely.
a personal
Absolutely.
point of view would be really helpful for me. I find that kind of concretizes things for me a bit.
Absolutely. Yeah, I always try to do that as much as possible. And if I forget, remind me. But for me, actually, I have, yeah, to me, Buddhism is the most important thing in my life. And I'll try to explain about that as we go along. But yeah, absolutely. That's the most important, because it's important to know, yeah, you know, and you need just very simple things, how do Buddhists practice? And like you say, what do they get out of it? What are the benefits? How does it change your life? Is absolutely crucial. And that is actually something that the Buddha strongly emphasized, because as we go through, we'll talk about Buddhism as Buddha taught it and explained it is a very practical thing. It's all about practice, what you do. Buddha explicitly tried to avoid theorizing about theology and so forth, but he actually focused the practice as the most important thing. So we'll talk about that. So thank you for asking for that, because that's what I intended to do. So I think we're in sync. So let me start off a little bit about that before I get into actually the main part of the course. I want to do a little bit of just introductory things. And first thing I want to talk about, sort of in line with what you were asking, is what is the goal of Buddhism? What's the point of Buddhism? What was Buddha trying to teach? The Buddha often talked about suffering a lot, and we will explain that, although it has a slightly different meaning than what you normally think. It's broader. But the opposite of that is actually happiness. And I think that's, especially from a point of, practical day-to-day benefit, I think that's probably the most important point. So the goal in Buddhism is, if you like, to be happy and to free yourself from suffering. And of course, that is a tall order, but I think there's two parts of it. There's both a short-term and a long-term part. And I think most people get caught up in the long-term part, which is enlightenment or nirvana. But I actually think the day-to-day short-term part is far more important. But before I get into that, I think one thing that's important to emphasize is the role of mind in Buddhism. In Buddhism, mind is the most important thing of all, any way you look at it. And if you look at this goal of happiness and avoiding suffering, the mind immediately comes into view, because all of our experiences, and Buddhism is really about how we experience life. All of our experiences go through our mind. So for example, the same event might happen to some person. Maybe their car breaks down. For some people, they'll just blow it off and they'll say, oh, well, that's too bad. I better get it fixed. Other people, it becomes this major thing. It makes them angry. They get really upset, and it really disturbs them. And what is the difference? And the difference is simply their mind. And it's the same way with suffering. I mean, some people can experience the same amount of physical discomfort, but for some of them, it's really traumatic. And for other people, it's not so. And what is the difference? The difference is the mind of the person. And so a lot of the key to becoming happy and reducing our suffering actually has to do with training the mind. And so a lot of Buddhism, a huge amount of Buddhism, is really involved with training the mind. And so again, I'm just throwing out a few things now. I'm going to explain them in much greater detail as we go deeper into it. But and then there's one other aspect too of the mind, is karma. So karma is one of these words that in the West it means almost anything. Hinduism has a different version of karma, but and actually one thing, since you have some Hindu background, it's important to emphasize, to actually talk a little bit about this. because it can be very confusing from somebody that comes from Hinduism towards Buddhism, is that Buddha tried to talk down to earth. He tried to talk in the everyday language of the common person. So, for example, the intellectual language in India has always been Sanskrit. And Buddha, as a highly trained person, a prince basically, clearly knew Sanskrit and could probably speak it fluently, but he always gave his teachings in the common languages. And he did that because he didn't want to be snobbish. He wanted everybody to understand. And along with trying to make it easier for people to understand, he tried to use terminology that was familiar to the people around him. And since he was in northern India, he used a lot of Hindu terminology. Although it was he was living around 500 BC, so it was sort of the earlier aspects of that terminology, not so advanced as some of the later Hinduism. But it was probably more Vedic Buddhism at the time. But nonetheless, what he did a lot is he took the Hindu terms and then he redefined those terms to make them Buddhist. So a lot of the terminology will sound Hindu, but they've been redefined and has a different meaning in Buddhism. And so it's important to realize that, otherwise you might get somewhat confused. For karma, we will talk a lot more about karma as we go along, but karma in Buddhism is created by the intention of the person. So it's really, what are you intending to do? And in particular, are you trying to harm or are you trying not to harm? That's probably the most crucial aspect for morality. And it's actually that intention, which is the crucial part that creates karma. The physical action can, influence the results of the resulting karma, but there's actually no karma without the intention of the mind. And for that reason, therefore, that makes mind extremely important. And that's also how you get these notions. I mean, a lot of people talk about mindfulness, and a lot of people know that Buddhism has a lot of mindfulness in it, and that the Buddha talked a lot about mindfulness. And part of that mindfulness, the importance of that mindfulness, is precisely because of the karmic implications. So if the intention in our mind creates karma, then we really need to be very strongly aware of what's going on in our minds. We have to be mindful of how we're thinking, what we're intending at each moment, because that's the only way we can have any control over the mind, is having that sort of mindfulness, that awareness that enables us to change and gradually start producing better intentions and reduce our negative intentions. And of course, you mentioned meditation. Actually, one of the key aspects of meditation has different things that go on in meditation. Meditation is a huge subject, and we actually teach many other courses in meditation. And of course, meditation is used differently in different religions also. But in Buddhism, just roughly, I could say there's two types of meditation. There's a meditation where you single-pointedly focus your mind on just one specific thing and hold it in your mind. So that's one-pointed concentration. But the second type of meditation is mindfulness meditation, where you're just aware of all of the things that are going on in your mind, all of your feelings, all of your thoughts, all of your intentions, and so forth. And what I might say is a common core of these two different types of meditation is that in both cases, the key is non-distraction. So in the single pointed one, you have to be non-distracted and just hold your object in your mind. But in your mindfulness, you also have to be non-distracted. You have to be in the present moment, aware of what's going through your mind and your feelings and so forth at this very moment, and not thinking about what happened in the past or the future, but you have to be mindful in the very present moment. And so being non-distracted is also the key quality of that meditation as well. Okay, so to go on more with these short and long-term goals of happiness and reducing suffering. Again, I'm just giving a few simple introductory words here. But basically in Buddhism, what Buddha really emphasized very much is a calm, peaceful mind is essential for deep happiness. So Buddha contrasted sort of sensual pleasure versus true happiness. And basically what Buddha always emphasized is that sensual pleasure, good food, good sex, good, lots of money, pleasurable things, good surroundings, all of these things we think bring us happiness. But what Buddha always emphasized, and we'll talk about this more in greater detail, is that there's something unsatisfactory about this type of happiness. And part of the way you can see it is, we always want more. So if you're eating some really good food, you want to eat more and more and more. You never want to stop. And it's always disappointing when you have to stop because your stomach's full. In fact, the ancient Roman solution to that was to vomit up all their food so that they could keep eating, which to me seems a little disgusting, but anyway. But that's always the problem, and people who are rich never seem to have enough money, no matter how many billions of dollars, they want even more billions of dollars. And so if all of these pleasures were satisfactory, you should be able to just stop and say, okay, I've got enough, I'm happy. But that never happens. And that sort of shows the dissatisfaction, which is what Buddha really meant by the word suffering, dukkha in Sanskrit, is really closer to dissatisfaction. So sensual happiness always is problematic in some way. And the other aspect about sensual happiness is it often leads us into various negative activities. For example, people that want money will try to steal, they'll try to do unethical actions to gain more money. People will abuse other people for sexual pleasure or other things. So when people are really focused on sexual pleasures, often there's a lot of negative activity about that. And Buddha often talked, in a sense, against sensual pleasure, but it wasn't, I think the idea is not so much that, it's not that pleasure is bad, but there's just these two aspects. One is it's never fully satisfactory, the way that spiritual pleasure is. But secondly, because of this negativity that it induces in us, it can be very dangerous. It can cause us to create a lot of negative karma, which will ultimately lead to future suffering. And he gave one beautiful, he used to talk in sort of beautiful imagery and analogies and so forth. And the way he explained it is he said, think about spreading honey on the edge of a very, very sharp knife, and then try to lick off the honey without cutting your tongue on the sharp edge. And he said that's basically the problem with sensual pleasure. If you can lick off the honey, enjoy the pleasure, but not get caught up in greed and hatred and all these other things, not cutting your tongue on the sharp edge, then that's really the problem. It's very, very difficult to just get the honey and not cut your tongue, meaning induce all of this negativity. So that's basically the idea there. The other aspects too that we're going to talk a lot about is a lot of making us happy is, in a sense, can be used, you can use another terminology, you can call it purifying the mind. And what are you purifying? You're purifying sort of the negative aspects of your mind, which are the things that actually make you really unhappy. So what are these negative aspects? These are things like greed, hatred, and delusion. They're sort of the three standard ones. And those three are said to actually originate in ignorance, not knowing how the world really works. And another way of talking about Buddhism is that Buddha was a realist. He said we have to look and understand the world as it really is. What Buddha said, the problem that we have most of the time is that most of our thinking is distorted. And it's distorted because, what is it distorted by? It's distorted by our sense of egotism, by we're always thinking, what's good for me, what's bad for me. So things that are good for me induce greed. Things that are bad for me that I don't like, I try to push away, and that induces hatred. I don't like this, I hate this. And in general, this whole distorted way of thinking is this delusion or this ignorance. And so we're going to talk a lot more about that. And of course, the opposites of those sorts of delusions are the things that make us happy. And there's one very simple practice that I always talk about in this class, because I think it really illustrates sort of how you can be happy in the present moment. And this is a practice that I actually is one of my main practices, and it's something that I do every day, and that is making a huge difference in my life. And so this is what's called a practice of loving kindness. The Buddha, it's actually part of a more extensive thing, which Buddha called the Brahma Vihara. Brahma in this context, not meaning the Brahman, the Hinduism, but just meaning something that is the highest, most excellent. And Vihara is the Sanskrit word for living. So living in the highest, the best way. And there were actually 4 of these things, but I'm just going to focus on the first 2 because they're simple. They don't even seem religious or Buddhist. They just seem very, very simple, and yet they can make you instantly happy. So what are these things? So imagine that you're at the grocery store and you see the checkout clerk, totaling up all the money, all of the groceries and so forth, and totaling up the bill. You can sit there and you can just think, may you be happy. May you be free from suffering. And then with as much as you can, really try to believe that wholeheartedly and try to wish that with all of your soul. Wish as strongly as you can that that person is happy and that person be free from suffering. And when you do that, watch your mind and see what's going on in your mind. And I think if you're like me, like most people I've talked to, what you will find is it will bring you an instant happiness. It'll just suddenly make you happy. And, you don't have to explain it. It's just, you will just experience that. And you can do that with everybody. You can do that with the person standing in front of you as you're driving down the road and somebody cuts in front of you. Instead of getting angry, you can say, may you be happy. May you be free. May you never have any suffering. And again, wish that with all as much as you can. And when you do that, see how it changes your mind. See how it, see how it changes the whole way that you look on life. And to me, that is sort of the closest thing I can come to instant happiness. And I practice this every day. And you can do this with whole groups. May everybody that's living in my neighborhood be happy and be free from suffering. May everybody that's living in my country be happy and free from suffering. May everyone who lives in the whole world be happy or free from suffering. And as we will eventually broaden in Buddhism to see even more types of being, may all sentient beings, all beings with a mind, be happy and free from suffering. And again, I suggest, Buddha always said to try things out. He said, don't believe anything I say just because I'm the Buddha. Go out and try these things that I'm teaching you and experience them and see how you feel about them. Because that's the way that Buddhism is meant to work. It's meant to be an experiential religion, if you like. And so I suggest that you just try this, and just see what happens. It is interesting because there's actually two more things, but I'm not going to get into that because that's more Buddhist. But these two things are very simple. And Buddha actually said that if you do this a lot and you train your mind in this way, you will actually have a very high rebirth. But that's not the reason I do it. The reason I do it is because my goal is to become a better person. Each day in my life, I want to be a better person. And every time I practice this, I feel like it's directing my mind, training my mind into how to be a better person. And when you become a better person, you become happier. So it's just a very simple thing, but I think it's extremely beneficial. So I just suggest that as one sort of starting point. So in the longer term, so that's the short term, and there's many things like that. Part of being happy is leading a positive mind, wishing to help people, be beneficial to people, non-harming. If you really study this or try to see how you experience it, you'll discover that all of these things always make you happier. And that's a big part of Buddhism, is this sort of training your mind in this direction. And of course, while you're doing that, you will be generating lots of positive karma. So in the future, that will lead to more happiness. And if you're practicing this kind of loving kindness, it's very difficult to generate negative activity. So again, it has also that, it's also very positive in that way. But more in the longer term, of course, the goal of all of Buddhism is nirvana or full enlightenment. And this is a way in which you will be able to remove all of your suffering permanently, forever. But in my mind, people too often get hung up. It's like, I want to become enlightened tomorrow or whatever. And what Buddha always emphasized is that the spiritual life is always a gradual life. You have to develop spirituality gradually and continuously, constantly working on it over and over again. And part of that is, so you have to focus on developing your spirituality gradually. So it's not like you make a sudden jump. And part of that is because all Buddhism is associated with cause and effect. So what Buddha said basically is that if you're going to do anything like create nirvana, you have to create the causes for that to happen. And the way you create the causes, so what is nirvana? Really, it's actually a completely pure mind. It's a mind that has completely destroyed forever all of these delusions like greed, hatred, and delusion. And you have to work on that gradually. Why do you have to work on and change that gradually? Because all of these delusions are actually bad habits of mind. And if you have a bad habit of mind, especially if it's entrenched through many, many lifetimes, as we'll see when we talk about rebirth, it takes a corresponding long time to sort of turn your mind around and retrain it in positive directions. And of course, the same thing. So what we're really trying to do is create positive habits of mind, to create positivity in our mind, and to remove all of these negative bad habits of mind. And that's how, over a long period of time, we actually purify our mind. And as you keep doing that bit by bit, that's what makes you happy. And you will get happier and happier the more pure your mind is. And again, you don't have to believe me, you don't have to believe Buddha. If you start practicing this, you can experience this directly for yourself. Okay, so now that's one thing. I want to do just a little bit more about intro before plunging into the main topic. And part of the reason I want to do this is because we live in the West. So if you look up Buddhism in the encyclopedia, Wikipedia, or whatever, you will see it classified as a major religion, and you'll see how many millions of Buddhists there are in the world versus how many Christians or Muslims or Hindu or whatever. So most people think of Buddhism as a religion. However, in the West, when we think of a religion, we have this long history of Christianity, which has dominated Europe and from there the United States and even Australia and other parts of the Western world. And so when people think about Buddhism as a religion, they bring a lot of baggage along with them. Baggage in the sense of not necessarily something bad, but they bring a lot of sort of assumptions along with them, which come from their Christian background. They expect Buddhism to be very similar to the way that Christianity was. And so I think it's useful just to clarify ways in which that doesn't work for Buddhism, that Buddhism is actually very different. And even from Hinduism. I mean, actually, Buddhism, a lot of people, because Buddhism uses a lot of Hindu terminology, they think that essentially Buddhism and Hinduism are exactly the same, but they're not. They actually have a very, very different point of view. And so anyway, but let's focus on the Christianity because that's the bigger thing for the West. So what are their differences? For one thing, in Christianity, the whole focus is on a creator God. You know, is there one God? Is there many gods? You know, the whole focus is on gods and how the universe was created. In Buddhism, there's no creator God. Essentially, the world has continued on forever. And it was not created by anybody. The other thing, too, is that Buddha is not a god. So Buddha was originally a human being, but the difference between Buddha and us is that the Buddha has completely purified his mind, and he's achieved nirvana or enlightenment, which we'll talk about. But all of us can do exactly the same thing. And in fact, what Buddha said, Buddha said, you know, I know that enlightenment is possible because I've done it. And if you do, you know, because again, this cause and effect, if you do exactly the same things that I did, you will also become a Buddha. So all of us are potential Buddhas. And the goal for all of us is this enlightenment or nirvana or liberation from samsara, which is the way that we permanently remove all our suffering. Okay, so that's one aspect that makes sort of things very different. So in Buddhism, there's not this big thing about that. There's no God that is actually punishing us. There is karma, but there's no God that is punishing us for doing negative actions. It's just a law of the universe. It's sort of like, it's in the same way that a rock experiences gravity. So if you put a rock in a gravitational field, it falls down. In the same way, if we generate negative karmic actions, we will suffer. But it's more like a law of gravity. It's not any sort of punishment or any sort of deity trying to control us or tell us how we have to behave. Another thing that is somewhat different is that in a lot different, you know, Christianity, of course, is very broad and has many different sects and beliefs and so forth. But there are a number of sects where they talk about being saved by God, that Jesus saves us, that you know, we have to have faith in Jesus or God, and that's what saves us. So there's a lot of emphasis on faith, for example, and putting the control of your life in God's hands and so forth. And Buddhism is very different in that Buddha stresses our own responsibility for our own spiritual life. So what Buddha said is basically you have to save yourself. You know, of course, you can get help, you can get teachers, you can get people who can help you along the path, you know, suggest ways of improving your spiritual life. But in the end, it's all up to us. And why is it up to us? You know, so in Buddhism, no, you know, monk or something can give you a blessing and absolve you of all your sins or cause you to become enlightened. There's no religious ceremony that you can do that, you know, saves you. But essentially, you have to save yourself by purifying your own mind of these negativities, this greed, hatred, and delusion. and which is a gradual process which you have to work on. And of course, meditation is one of the key practices that you use to actually work through all of this. And so again, and that's why this emphasis is on training the mind, because where do all of these negativities occur? They occur in our own mind. And so since only we can change our mind, and we are responsible for our own mind, therefore, we are the people who have to do our own purification. Again, getting help and so forth. Okay, so that's a very different. Another aspect too is, of course, the afterlife. In Christianity, there's you get one life and then eternity in either heaven or hell. So Buddhism is very different in that. And so in a sense, Christianity has rebirth. So we have this life, and then we're reborn, if you like, in either heaven or hell after we die. And so there is an afterlife in Buddhism, and there are heavens and there's hells and there's various states that you can be reborn in. But the difference is that everything in the world in which we live, which Buddha called samsara, is impermanent. There's no permanence anywhere in our life. So we might be reborn in a heavenly realm, but then that rebirth in a heavenly realm was created, again, caused by our positive karma. And when we burn up all of that positive karma, we fall back down to a lower realm. And again, you have negative karma that maybe puts you in a hell realm for a while, but then you burn up that negative karma and you rise up again. So in Buddhism, there is an afterlife, and there's many, many lives. There's not just one life and then eternity, but a continual recycling of life, of rebirth, and that's what's called samsara. And the ultimate solution for that, which is what nirvana is escaping from this round of samsara by creating the causes or removing the causes that cause us to be reborn continually in samsara. And so that's, again, we'll have to discuss how you do that and how that works. Okay, but anyways, so that's again a difference from Christianity. Again, there's, you're never permanently stuck anywhere. The positive way of looking at this is that you've got an infinite number of chances to reach nirvana, and you'll never infinitely get stuck in a negative place. So you can think about it that way, as sort of a positive way. Another aspect is we can talk about morality. So in Christianity, you have the 10 Commandments and so forth. Ironically, the Buddha taught sort of something, 10 non-virtuous actions, and the opposite of that are 10 virtuous actions. So it's almost sort of similar to the 10 Commandments, and many of these things are very similar. But I would say that in Buddhism, the focus on morality is really non-harming yourself, non-harming others. And in Buddhism, morality is very flexible. So it's not a rigid rule. You do this and it's bad. But in Buddhism, you always, again, as I talked about, intention is the key to karma. So in Buddhism, what's really important is the whole situation, what's going on. And so all of the details in the situation in which you're embedded make a difference as to whether an action is moral or immoral. In other words, leads to positive or negative karma, if you like. It depends on what's going on, what your intention is. And you can't just externally divide up things, this is right, this is wrong. You have to really understand what's going on and what the intention is. So that's sort of a difference in the somewhat possibly in the morality, or at least that's a way of understanding how morality works in Buddhism. Another thing too, which is quite interesting, is in Buddhism, you don't have the religious hierarchy that you do with many other religions. And again, I'll have to qualify and explain what I meant by this. But one way of saying it is that just before Buddha died, and Buddha actually announced ahead of time, I'm going to die in 3 months or whatever. The monks all came to him. They said, we're going to be lost without you. We need a leader. You've got to appoint somebody to take over all of the monks and lead them so that we follow the correct path. But Buddha refused to do this. And so another way you can say it is that Buddha refused to appoint a Pope of Buddhism. There is no Pope of Buddhism. What Buddha said is, he said, I'm not going to appoint anyone to lead you. What you have to do is instead follow the Dharma, follow the teachings that I gave. I've told you everything you need to know. I haven't held back anything. I've taught you everything that you need to do to practice the spiritual life. So focus on that. And so Buddhism has always been, for that reason, not authoritarian. There's never been this hierarchy. So in the present day, of course, there's many, many different forms of Buddhism. There's Theravadan Buddhism, which is in places like Sri Lanka and Thailand and so forth. There's Tibetan Buddhism, which is what our center has its focus from. There's Buddhism that went to China. I will explain these things. But all of these different Buddhist things have their own leaders of their own little religious following. But there's nobody that leads Buddhism for everybody. So many people know the Dalai Lama, for example, who's very influential, very deep, spiritual, wonderful person. But he's not the Pope of Buddhism. He doesn't control what all of these other Buddhists do. And in fact, he doesn't even control that. There are actually, I'll explain, there's 4 different religious groupings in Tibet, or from Tibetan Buddhism, and he's not even formally in charge of, each of these different forms actually have their own leader. And he's not even in charge of the Gelug sect, which is the one that he formally belongs to. Even though the Tibetans, especially since they've been pushed out of Tibet by China, they really heavily rely on the Dalai Lama. But there is no Pope of Buddhism. There's nobody who can tell you how to live your life as a Buddhist. So for all of us, so in that sense, Buddhism is sort of free. You don't have, if you feel karmically connected with Tibetan Buddhism, you can follow all the rules and all the ways that Tibetan Buddhism practices. But if you don't like that, you could switch to Theravadan Buddhism, or you can do whatever kind of Buddhist practice you want. There is no formal.
Bob, I've got a question.
Okay.
I don't know if you want to address it now, because I know it goes off a little bit of a different direction.
Okay.
Connected to what you've just said, and this is one of the stumbling blocks I have,
Okay.
is the guru thing is really emphasized.
Yes.
And that's where I sort of start to feel, that's where I feel uneasy.
Okay. Yes,
Okay?
I understand that. I'm a very independent person, and I think a lot of us from the West really struggle with the guru thing. It's very much more of an Eastern type of cultural phenomena. So the guru is strongly emphasized in Tibetan Buddhism. I mean, it is really a big deal in Tibetan Buddhism. However, if you go into Theravadan Buddhism, it's not such a big deal. Okay. So again, some of the guru stuff is cultural, and it relates to the type of Buddhism that you're in. So the Tibetans would say, the spirit, if you don't have a guru leading you, the spiritual life is impossible. But I don't think that's universally true everywhere. So again, I think that is one of the sort of tricky things, because as Buddhism is spread around the world, each culture is sort of adapted to each culture. And so it can be a little bit tricky to know which things are sort of coming from the culture and which things are coming from the original Buddhism. Now, given that, of course, I would say, we all need teachers. It's hard to do things on your own. What the Buddha himself said, he said, I gave you the Dharma. However, the Dharma can be, if you just go off and read the Buddhist scriptures, sometimes it can be difficult to understand what they're saying. And so it's very helpful to have teachers who can explain them to you. So I would say, you don't have to rely on a guru. And I would say, even in the Tibetan tradition, as it's practiced in the United States, even though they talk so heavily about guru devotion and so forth, in practice, the way it's practiced in most parts of America where I'm familiar, Australia has a strong Tibetan tradition also. So it's probably very similar there, but I don't know since I'm not there. But anyway, when you had Tibetan monks, and I mean like a large fraction of the population in ancient Tibet were Tibetan monks. I mean, every family sent at least one son, maybe two sons, into these monasteries. And it was considered to be, necessary for the welfare of their family. At least that's the way they felt. So when you were in these monasteries, it was very easy to have gurus because you had all these older monks around you. You had millions of monks who could be your guru. And so you could get very detailed religious instructions, very personal instructions from, really heavy duty, serious, amazing spiritual monks to be your guru. However, in the West, we have, in our sort of little center, our little Buddhist center, we've got one Tibetan monk for all of us. And so he can't be running around giving us detailed instructions. So the guru thing just doesn't quite work the same way in the setting of which we have in America. And so for the most part, what a lot of people, you ask a lot of people, who's my guru? They will say something, oh, it's the Dalai Lama, or it's, and from our Tibetan centers were created by Lama Zopa. So many people will say Lama Zopa. However, they may have met in person Lama Zopa once in their life. Maybe some of us, like I've seen the Dalai Lama, across the vast stage with thousands of people. So I've never met him personally. So, and so I would say that, the guru thing for Westerners probably is more difficult to realize unless you're very lucky, unless you live in a very small center and you make a real personal connection. And I would say also that the guru thing becomes important as you become more and more advanced spiritually. In the beginning, we're all just practicing simple instructions. And so it's not so critical. But if you get to very high levels of, for example, Vajrayana or Tantric teachings, then a guru becomes more and more essential. So anyway, I would say that you shouldn't worry about the guru thing. The Tibetans like it, but in practice, we each have our own spiritual life and our own spiritual needs, and we have specific karma. You might make a close connection with a very powerful Tibetan monk or some other Buddhist monk who has a strong influence. And if that happens, that's wonderful. And then you can rely on that person. That can be very helpful. But in practice, it's actually very difficult to get that sort of one-on-one personal guru relationship in the West, just because there's not enough monks around. We're just sort of so scattered. I don't know. Does that help a little bit?
Yes, definitely. I like the fact that you identify as being an independent person, as do I. And I have had an experience, for instance, I had a chat with 3 different lay people one day, all 3 of whom basically encouraged me to get a guru. And I thought, whoa, this is not my path.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too that I feel strongly about my own personal relationship with Buddhism is the more I practice Buddhism, the more relaxed I am. My feeling about my own personal, I don't have like a really close guru who's directing me, and I never have. I mean, I have, various monks. We have a wonderful Geshe Sherab at our center who's absolutely wonderful, but I don't actually go for him for practical advice. I mean, what happens for most people is the practical advice for how to practice Buddhism usually mainly comes in classes. So I don't personally rely on any person. And my own personal feeling is that if you are trying very hard to lead a spiritual life, you will get what you need. So if it's important for you to have a guru will somehow, in some way, show up in your life. And then you'll connect and you'll make that connection, you'll get it. But if you don't need a guru right now, I wouldn't worry about it. You know, I think that you know, I'm not, I've never been so worried about it the way the Tibetans are. And it just doesn't seem to work in the American Buddhist centers that I've been around. And so I would say if you're doing some very deep forms, like I say, Vajrayana or tantric forms of Buddhism, you have an empowerment and you're going through some very deep types of meditation, you might need some help. So I think you should just rely on yourself. I think you will know if you need a guru. If you're really struggling, if you feel lost, then you might need a guru. But especially if you're at the beginning stages of Buddhist study, I would say it's don't worry about it. It'll come if you need it. So I don't know if that's helpful or not.
No, it's very helpful that it's not a necessity. And as you say, if it's time, then it'll come. But the emphasis for somebody like me, where I've been encouraged to do that, where I'm quite resistant.
Yes.
I like I like the concept that is articulated certain, I don't know if in Buddhism, but I do have a fair amount of faith of the internal guru, because like yourself, my goal in life is to be a good person. And it's like, I've looked at everything long enough that I feel like if I just quietly take a breath, go inside and ask myself the question, the answer will come.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing I would say too, I mean, what Buddha himself said, he said, let Dharma be your guide. Let the Buddhist teachings be your guide. And if there's some parts of the Buddhist teachings that you don't understand, I would say go off and take classes or talk to more experienced Buddhists or ask questions or read books or do whatever you need to do to understand them. But I would say, again, don't worry about it. And there's also a very general philosophy that I received as I was going through. I've been doing studying Buddhism now for almost 20 years. But the general philosophy that I always get is if there's some part of Buddhism that disturbs you, that doesn't sit well with you, ignore it for now. Don't worry about it. Focus on those parts which do seem helpful, which do seem beneficial to you, and focus on working on those. And if you do that, as I say, as you deepen your spiritual path, if you need something, you will find it. So I would say, since the guru thing disturbs you, I would say, forget about it completely. By all means, don't look for a guru. Focus on the things that do work for you. And like I say, if you really do need a guru, later on, you'll know it. And you'll go look for one, or it will appear to you, or something will happen. You don't need to worry about it. I think people sort of get so uptight. They sort of think, oh, if I don't do this one thing, my whole life is finished. It's destroyed. My spiritual life is over. I mean, in reality, the spiritual life is very, very broad. And each of us has our own backgrounds, and each of us has our own path, if you like. And so we have to follow the path that works for us. And so there's no cookie cutter thing, or there's just one rigid path and everybody lockstep follows it. You have to follow the path that works for you. And you have to study the things that you need to learn and that help you more directly. And you should just really, if there's something disturbing, put it aside, and just leave it there for later. You don't have to go into this thing, oh, the guru thing is all wrong. The guru thing works very well for many people. And in certain circumstances, it's necessary. But it's not necessary, I don't think, at all stages of your spiritual path. And I think, if you, at some point, if you do need it, it will be there. So again, I would say, relax with it. And I sort of think that about all of these different Buddhist teachings. If there's a Buddhist teaching that you just don't really get, just temporarily put it aside, and later on, as you have a deeper understanding of other things, it may make more sense for you, or maybe it never will. But, there's not one key thing that makes this life or death. It's a broad spiritual path. and you have to sort of focus on those areas that you need to work on. So anyway, I should probably stop here because otherwise I'll never finish the course. And in general, I mean, the other thing I would say that also gets into this other thing that I was going to talk about. Well, there's several things. One, in Buddhism, beliefs aren't the big thing. You know, in Christianity, what you believe made this huge difference. And if you didn't believe certain things, you could actually get burnt at the stake in the medieval ages, the Reformation. So in Christianity, there's always this thing about, whether you believe in God or don't believe in God, whether you believe in this or that, there's a huge emphasis. But in Buddhism, and I would probably say more generally in Eastern religions, the emphasis is not so much on theology as it is on actual practice. What, the sort of spiritual, whether you're a good person and the spiritual life that you practice. And Buddha emphasized, Buddha gave different teachings to different people because he realized that different people had different capacities and were at different levels. And the Buddha would always focus his teachings on whatever he thought the people needed especially to hear. And that's always been a tradition in Buddhism, that we always adapt Buddhism to the specific needs of the person. Another thing, too, that Buddha taught was de-emphasizing religious ceremony. So, in some forms of Hinduism, people go into sacred rivers and they bathe to purify themselves for their negativities. And basically, Buddha said, no, that's not the way it works. If you want to purify, you have to purify your own mind. You have to get rid of these hatreds, greed, delusions. That's how you purify. You don't have somebody come up and give you some religious ceremony and bless you, and that purifies it. So in Buddhism, there was always this focus on spiritual practice, not on religious ceremonies. Now, there are different forms of Buddhism. Some forms of Buddhism actually have some very a lot of religious ceremony, and in particular, the form of Buddhism I'm involved with, Tibetan Buddhism, has a lot of religious ceremony. And that's because I think of the culture. The Tibetans like a lot of ceremony. But in this case, really, if you look more closely at what the religious ceremony is about, it's about two things. One is about training your mind. When you're doing this religious ceremony, you're supposed to pay attention to the words of all of the prayers because you're trying to train your mind to think in this special way, this positive way. And the second aspect of it is that, again, it's for merit creation. So at the beginning of all Tibetan religious ceremonies, they always do a little beginning part where they focus on the intention that you're bringing to that religious ceremony, because it's that intention to improve your spiritual life, which is what generates the positive merit from the religious ceremony. It's not the religious ceremony itself. So anyway, so even if there is a lot of religious ceremony in Buddhism, the important thing is not the actual, what you're actually doing, it's what's going on in your mind. And in the original form of Buddhism, as Buddha taught, there was almost no religious ceremony. Okay. So that's another aspect that's somewhat different. Again, in terms of punishment, there's no punishment for doing negative actions by some god or some deity. It's more just, karma is just it's like a law of gravity. It's the way the world works. And then finally, what I would say is that, because Buddha basically said, he didn't create a formal religion. So I would say it's actually fine to practice whatever form of Buddhism you like. It's like there are all these different traditions. And of course, if you were born in Tibet, you practice Tibetan Buddhism. But for us in the West, we actually have a choice. There's Zen Buddhism, there's Tibetan Buddhism, there's Theravadan Buddhism. There's many different forms of Buddhism. And I would say you should go whatever you feel most comfortable with. Because I don't think it really matters. In the end, you will arrive at the same place. in the end, the focus of all of these different forms of Buddhism is to purify your mind, to become a better person. They have slightly different techniques for doing it. And because of their long history, certain deep religious teachers have found certain things very efficacious, and they suggest practicing in that way. But, there's nothing essential. There's nothing that says, Buddha did not create a pope of Buddhism. He said, just practice the Dharma. So there's no negative thing by practicing or not practicing a particular form of Buddhism. Again, I think you should be relaxed about it. In general, what most people say is that for any sort of spiritual life, it's good to just focus on one thing because you can deepen that practice. Whereas if you're flitting from all of these different forms of Buddhism, you might become very superficial and you might never get anywhere. So it's good, I think, to just try to pick out something that you feel comfortable with and then stick with it, and at least try to spend a fair amount of time with that one form of Buddhism, because I think it's that there is this danger that we can just only do things that we like and sort of be a little bit superficial. And it's in that sense too, what makes you a Buddhist? So who decides who is a Buddhist and who isn't a Buddhist? And again, this is different than Christianity, where you need to be baptized. So you need a religious ceremony. In Buddhism, basically, you're a Buddhist if you decide you're a Buddhist. The traditional definition of a Buddhist is one who goes for refuge to the three jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, meaning basically you follow the Buddhist teachings, the Dharma. You believe, you have confidence that Buddha gave correct teachings, and you rely on your Sangha, your Buddhist friends, to sort of help you on your Buddhist path. And so that's the traditional definition of a Buddhist. But in general, in Buddhism, faith doesn't mean blind faith. Buddha himself said, don't believe what I say just because I said it, but gain experience for yourself. See for yourself if what I said makes sense and is true. And that is the sort of mantra, or if you like, the theme that goes through all of Buddhism. It's important what faith in Buddhism really means is confidence based on your own experience, that you can sort of see that it's working and it makes sense. Okay, so let me stop here and let me ask if there's any other questions before I launch into sort of the main part of the course.
No, I've got nothing pressing right now. It's what you're saying is very helpful for me. And I'll also at this point say, I found your example of wishing well for people, like you mentioned when you go to the shops, right? Go to the store. Yeah. I mean, what I try to do is to sort of recognize that the person I'm interacting with has a divine nature or a Buddha nature. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But the actual active sort of wishing them well, I think would be very beneficial for me, particularly that pesky person who cuts me off in the car.
Yes.
That's a source of great unhappiness to me.
Well, in Buddhism, they always say, practice on the easy example first.
Yeah. Okay.
So if it's difficult, start with your family, your relatives, your close friends, and then gradually you can work out to the more difficult cases. But it's very helpful because if you establish that kind of mind that wishes everybody to be happy and free from suffering, that is just such a positive mind.
Yep. I agree.
It can't help but set you heading in the right direction.
Yep.
At least that's what I find. I find it very, very
I find that more active than what I normally do, which, like I say, is just to, in my mind, go, okay, this person is manifesting their divine nature in a way, maybe I'm not keen on, but still it's under there. But yes. To actually then do a more active recognition of, okay, I'm going to wish them well regardless.
Yes,
that's an important lesson for me. Yeah.
Yeah. And the important thing too is pay attention to how you feel when you do that. Because again, it's that, it's like experiencing, it's like when people are generous, giving, loving, it really does make you happy. But most of the time we blow past it. We don't pay attention to it. It's this mindfulness thing, being aware of what's going on inside of our feelings, our mind. And so it's really important to sort of pay attention to how that makes you feel, because that is a huge boost. Because for me, it's like when you get that burst of happiness, when you start acting in those ways, it really it's really a positive force propelling your spiritual life forward. So anyway, I just strongly suggest pay attention also to how you feel when you're going through these sort of, and again, it's just try this out, see how it works. Okay, so let's switch over. So now I'm going to begin sort of the formal part of the course. And I'm going to begin with the life story of Buddha. So Buddhism is based on a real person who lived roughly around 500 BC. The actual exact dates of Buddha's life, we don't know precisely. So it could literally be plus or minus 100 years. But 500 years just seems like a nice round number, and it seems roughly right. And the reason we don't know so perfectly when Buddha lived is just basically because in the culture of ancient India, they just didn't seem to pay that much attention to accurate dating the way we have in the West. And so it's a problem with a lot of history in ancient India. When did it exactly happen? It can be sometimes tricky to actually nail down precise dates. But I think, roughly 500 BC is just a good round number. And that's probably very close. So that's when Buddha lived. So who was Buddha? As I said, Buddha was a man. As he gave in later teachings, he had been reborn countless times, and he actually could remember after he became Buddha, he could remember a lot of his former lives. And he actually talked about those in many cases, as illustrations of how to live. But so we often give a longer name for Buddha. We call him Buddha Shakyamuni. And basically Shakya is the clan name for the Buddha, so he came from the Shakyan people. And Muni just basically means sage or wise person. And Buddha means really basically enlightened or even awakened person. Sometimes he was also called Prince Siddhartha. So what was it like when Buddha grew up? Well, Buddha grew up in the Shakyan kingdom. Sometimes today, scholars think it was actually not so much a kingdom as a republic. Maybe there was, the leaders were voted in. There was a larger sort of country or kingdom around Kosala, and probably the Shakya little like city-state country, if you like, was probably a vassal of this bigger kingdom of Kosala. This was in very far northern India. So parts of it even go into parts of southern Nepal. And in fact, in modern days, Nepal and India often fight over some of the sacred sites, which belongs to which because they want tourists. But anyway, it was sort of just on the border of Nepal, so very far north in India. And at that time, the way India was organized is there were sort of all of these small little countries, if you like, some of them almost like city-states, sort of small kingdoms. And so they traditionally call Buddha's father the king of the Shakyan land. Although, like I say, it might have been a republic. And all of these little kingdoms were constantly fighting each other. The way it always happens, they were always in battle, trying to take over each other. So Buddha's father was called King Shuddhadana, And his mother was called Queen Maya or Maya Devi. Of course, there's a lot of mythology and religious overlay that grew up about Buddha's birth because, after it all happened, we know that Buddha was Buddha. But at the time when Buddha was born, it was said that there were lots of dreams, that they had soothsayers and, sort of prophets saying, there were sort of these signs that maybe some important person was going to be born. And they asked this one sage or soothsayer about it. And he said, oh, yeah, I mean, it's definite. This child that's going to be born, the future Buddha, is going to be a really powerful person. And he could go either two ways. He can either become a great king called a wheel-turning king, Chakravartin king, or, and if you become this sort of king, you actually, because of your goodness, your good nature, you end up taking over all of India. Or the other way he could go is he could become a great spiritual leader. So that has an implication for the way that Buddha was raised, because his father, of course, wanted to become a great king. He didn't want him to become a religious leader. So for that reason, according to the standard biography, Buddha grew up in great luxury. His father was always encourages him to be sort of secular, if you like, and not religious. Buddha himself said, that there were 3 seasons in India, and he had a separate palace for each of those 3 seasons. And those palaces were often stocked with beautiful women who would sing and dance and be his servants. And again, because the king his father wanted to sort of keep him in the secular world and away from the religious aspects. And eventually, he received all of the training that you need to acquire as a prince. And he eventually married. He married Yasodhara, and he had one child whose name was Rahula. And shortly before his first child was born, again, this is a very schematic sketch of his life. We don't actually know a lot of the huge details. We know only little tidbits that the Buddha mentioned in later teachings. But what Buddha said is that Buddha explained that what was really important in his life is what he called the 3 messengers. So the 3 messengers are, and some people say there's 4 messengers. So just before, again, his first child was born, the Buddha got curious about, he had been his father had sort of kept him, locked away in these palaces. And the Buddha got curious about the outside world. So he got his attendant to take him out. And as they were roaming around in the city, he saw a sick person. And that really upset him. He says, oh, there's sickness in this land. Maybe I could become sick also. This would be terrible. It's terrible that people have to experience sickness. So that was the first messenger. And then later on, he went out again, and this time he experienced an old person. And that led him to think, oh, eventually I will become old, and it's terrible to become old. Your body slowly, you have lots of problems when you become old, and that's really terrible. That's really not acceptable. And finally, on a third outing, he ran across a person who was being cremated, who had died, and that brought up the whole notion of death. And basically, what these 3 messengers, and there's actually, in some cases, they talk about a 4th messenger, which the Buddha saw what is often translated as an ascetic, a religious person. And so he became aware that you could lead a religious life, that there was other choices in life. And the result of this is what Buddha felt, is he felt basically greatly disturbed by the fact of suffering in the world. And what the Buddha said is, he said, it's unacceptable that human beings have to experience suffering. This cannot be right. There has to be some way out of this. There has to be a solution. And so the importance of this is that this is what, in the traditional readings, is what sets him on his path, his spiritual path. He makes the determination, I'm going to find a solution to human suffering. I'm going to find a way of living so that all human suffering is completely eliminated. And so he decided to follow the ascetic way of life. Now, at that time in ancient India, and in fact it's true today, you had different forms of religion. You had the traditional Brahmins and the Vedic religion and all of the religious sacrifices that go along with that form of religion, actually very similar to the ancient Greeks. And that's no accident, because actually the Brahmins were part of a group of Indo-Europeans somewhere in the steppes of Australia. Some of these people migrated toward Greece and formed the ancient Greek language and the elite of the ancient Greeks. Some of them headed toward India and they became the Brahmins. And so in both cases, they carried with them. Actually, the ancient Greek language is very similar to Sanskrit, the traditional Vedic religious language. And again, it's because they came from the same people. And of course, the Brahmins were lighter skinned people because they came from outside, and the original inhabitants were darker skinned. And then they set up, of course, the caste system, where the Brahmins eventually were on top. But anyway, at that time, so you had the traditional Vedic religions, and you had the Brahmins who were running a lot of the thing, except for the kings and soldiers and military people, which is the clan that Buddha came from. And then you had these other people who would just wander in the forest. And these other people were religious people of all stripes. Some of them were materialists. Some of this is where you got, the later forms of the Vedanta and so forth, the later forms of Hinduism. But these people generated all sorts of different types of religious beliefs. But the people who lived in the cities supported them, because these people wandering around the forest and so forth would come into the city for alms and would be fed and given medicine and sometimes shelter within the cities. And this was the tradition of India, which still is carried on today. There are still people who wander around like this in India with all sorts, who just give teachings or whatever. And the average Indian people venerate them as religious people. So Buddha went off and formed part of this class of people. And he actually went and he found a teacher. And the first teacher he went to taught him very deep forms of meditation. And eventually the Buddha realized, okay, I can do this too. And he reached the same level of meditation as his teacher. And at that point, his teacher invited him to become a co-teacher. But Buddha basically said, okay, I've learned these deep meditations, but they still haven't solved my problem. I still don't know how to get rid of human suffering. And so the Buddha left, and he found another teacher who taught him an even deeper level of meditation. And once again, the Buddha made the determination, I can do this, and I'm going to learn this. And so he learned that form as well or better than his teacher. And this time the teacher wanted him to make him the teacher instead of the original teacher. But again, the Buddha felt like, I'm still, I haven't solved the problem. This isn't okay. And so he wandered off again. So at this point, all of this wandering took place around the age of 29. So he started all of this wandering ascetic life around the age of 29. And he wandered as an ascetic for 6 years until around the age of 35, which is when he became the Buddha. But for most of these 6 years, he got in with a group of 5 other ascetics, and he practiced extreme asceticism. The sort of thing where you might eat a single grain of rice once a week or something like that. It's like the Buddha actually talked about how he practically destroyed his bodies. You could see every bone in his body coming out because he had really no flesh on it or skin on his, he was just pure bones and skin. He almost killed himself off because of this extreme asceticism. But the problem is that it didn't work. It didn't get him anywhere. He did this extreme asceticism and he still never solved this problem. And then one day he just realized, this isn't working. I got to do something different. And at that point, according to the story, he remembered a time when he was a young boy and he had just sort of been sitting under a tree, meditating, watching his father do some religious ceremony for planting crops or something, which he did as king. And he remembered this wonderful, calm meditation. And that's where he came up with the idea of sort of the middle ground, sort of the middle way of doing things. So not being extreme in one way or the other. And he thought, that's the solution. That's the type of meditation I have to do. So he stopped this extreme form of life. He started eating again, becoming normal. And so basically what he said is that what he felt is that the correct form of spiritual life is this middle ground, this middle way of doing things. So one extreme is extreme of the way he lived as a prince, extreme luxury, sensual satisfaction, and so forth. So that's one extreme. The other extreme is this extreme asceticism where you just torture your body. And he said, basically, that doesn't do any good. And so basically, he hit upon this middle way of practicing. So he wasn't going to live in the lap of luxury. He was going to live a simple life. But on the other hand, he wasn't going to torture his body, but he was going to meditate. And that's when he sat under the Bodhi tree and achieved full enlightenment at that point. So roughly at the age of 35. And then after that, of course, he became a teacher and he taught this middle way that he had learned. And he basically taught this from the age of 35 until he died around the age of 80. And that's where we have all the teachings about, and that's what we're going to, of course, talk about for the rest of the course. At the end of his life, when he was around 80, again, he died, and there were all of these mystical things that happened, earthquakes and so forth. But I think the important thing, the two things that happened were, as I said before, is he refused to appoint someone to lead Buddhism. So he basically refused to set up a formal religion. He told the elder monks, of course, take care of the younger monks, teach them, spread my teachings and so forth, but let Dharma be your guide to the spiritual life. So there was no official spiritual leader, no formal religion that was set up. The second thing he said, which I thought was quite interesting, is he told his followers to be either an island or lamp unto themselves and to be led by the Dharma. And the reason why there is this confusion of island or lamp is because this word in the language that he used, Dipa, can mean either island or lamp. And part of the reason why there's a confusion between it is because in the simple language that the people spoke, it was like a simplified Sanskrit. And some of the ways that the words got translated from the, sort of the intellectual language, the Sanskrit, into the simple vernacular, was sometimes they dropped letters. So sometimes you had a word that could have exactly the same pronunciation, but it could come from two different Sanskrit words, which sounded the same because letters had been dropped. So in this word that he used, Dipa, could mean either island or lamp. So Buddha was saying either be an island or a lamp unto yourself. And I think the island is this notion of, he always stressed going off and meditating by yourself as the key to the spiritual path. And being a lamp unto yourself is this notion of being, I think, led by Dharma. So anyway, and then, okay, so at that point, he has died. And then we're going to have to continue this story next week because it's 8:30. So we've run out of time. But what we're going to do now is talk about what happened to Buddhism after Buddha died. So how did Buddhism evolve and what happened to it? And so that's the way we're going to start off with next week. And then after that, the other thing we're going to talk about next week is, if you like, the main teaching of Buddhism, which is the Four Noble Truths. Because I think understanding the Four Noble Truths is the key to understanding that is the core Buddhism of all Buddhism. And that is, it's these Four Noble Truths that distinguish Buddhism from Hinduism or all other forms of religion. And then after that, then we will go through the rest of the Buddhist path in more detail. But the core of the Buddhist path is these Four Noble Truths. So our next session, a week from today, will focus on both finish up with the history of Buddhism and how it spread and why we have so many different forms of Buddhism and how did they develop. And then also going into this key teaching, which is really, really, I think, the key to understanding Buddhism. So let me stop here and ask if there's any more questions. So we have a few minutes.
Yeah, and okay. Here is a question that always comes up for me, and I realize it's determined by cultural situation, but the fact that Buddha left his child and wife, this is a bit of an impediment.
Oh yeah, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think all women feel bad about that,
And I mean, I realize in the culture of the time, that would be, an okay thing to do because you had a higher calling. But it's still, in terms of our interpretation, a little bit shocking. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I agree. And I have to admit, I felt the same way. I felt, it's like, it would have been better if he hadn't married or whatever. I mean, the other thing too that I forgot to mention is that when Buddha was born, his mother died a very short time afterward, like a few weeks or maybe a month later. And he was actually brought up by his mother's sister, his aunt. But at any rate, yeah. And I think one way of understanding that, though, is one thing that helps me when I understand that is again, I think the key thing is that he did have this higher calling, but he would go back and visit his family from time to time all throughout his teachings. He would wander all around the northern India lands and would periodically go back to his home country. But the other thing that did happen is that of course, his mother was dead, but his aunt that brought him up, as well as his wife and Rahula, his son, ultimately all became enlightened. So he actually brought all of them to enlightenment. And I think the other thing too is that, in a karmic sense, both his wife and his child, and actually a number of his other relatives were also brought to enlightenment or liberation from samsara. So all of these people, he actually ultimately hugely benefited. And all of these people must have had extraordinary karma to be, can you imagine what type of karma it would be you would need to have to be the wife of Buddha or to be the son of Buddha? And actually, he gave many, as his son grew older, his son would travel with him, and he would actually give personal religious instructions to his son. And there's a lot of, I haven't talked about the Buddhist scriptures. There are these sutras which actually describe in detail many of the teachings that Buddha gave. And there are a number of these sutras which actually relate the specific teachings that Buddha gave his son Rahula. So all of these people, so yes, he did leave his son and wife, although his, his wife was a princess, his son was a prince, and all of them were, had no problem being taken care of. I mean, they were the royalty. They were like the royal family of the country in which they lived. So there was no problem about, he wasn't leaving them in a lurch. They were well taken care of. And ultimately, they benefited in this amazing way. And I'm sure that, that there was much contact all throughout his life. So I don't know if that helps in any way, or if it makes you feel, it makes me feel a little better when I realize that they all became liberated from samsara. They all became completely pure beings. And they must have been probably very pure beings, even when they were born, to have the karma to be born, to have such a close relationship to the Buddha. Yep. So I don't know if that makes you feel any better about it or not.
It helps. It does help. Yes.
But I know what you mean. That was the first, your reaction was the same thing that hit me. What? He left his wife and child? And in fact, he left his child just about barely. The child had barely been born when he left.
Yep.
Okay. So,
Lovely.
Okay.
Thanks,
So
Bob.
I will end here then. And hopefully I will see you next week then. And we will just forge ahead.
Lovely. Thanks again.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.